Okay, in this video we're going to talk about matrix equations. The hard part about matrix equations is doing all the steps. So here's how I see it. I see a matrix equation, and immediately this kind of looks like to me that we have an example like this. We have like 5z is equal to 10. And what I'd really like to do is I'd really like to divide both sides by 5. But the problem is, and I get z equals 2. And so we can solve that pretty easily. But the problem is, you can't divide matrices. So you can't divide them. So we have to do a different step. We have to take an inverse. And in this equation, instead of dividing by 5, what I could have done right off the bat is I could have times this side by a fifth and this side by a fifth. If you do that on your calculator, you see that this cancels out and just gives you z, and this would give you 2. So it essentially does the same thing. So we're going to have to do the same thing with this matrix. We are going to have to times this thing over here by its inverse and this by its inverse. So our first step is going to be taking the inverse. Our second step will then be multiplying both sides. And our final step, well, after we've multiplied both sides, we should just then have what our equation equals. So we should be able to find what z is. So our first step, again, we're going to take the inverse of this thing. So if you remember from the last video, taking the inverse, we're first going to find the determinant of this thing. So the determinant is going to equal a and d, which will be 0, minus negative 9, which will give me just a positive 9. Now, after we've done that and find the determinant, we are going to flip this and get 0 and 1, and get positive 9 and negative 1. So we just inverted the matrix, and our last step normally would be taking this thing over here and dividing everything on the inside by that 9. But we're not going to do that because we'd get decimals, and we don't want to work with decimals if we can avoid it. So now we're going to multiply each side by this matrix. When we multiply this matrix over here, we get its inverse matrix. We get the identity matrix, which would give me 1, 0, 0, 1, which is essentially 1. So we don't have to actually multiply that side. So basically, this thing cancels, and I get z equals this matrix times this matrix. So we're just going to do that step. Now we times matrix when we do this stuff. We times matrices row by column. So we're going to do all the steps and do times the rows and the columns. So when we times this out, I'm not going to forget my 1/9. Well, we'd get 0 times negative 8, which will give me negative 72. So negative 35 times 0 is 0. 9 times 8 is negative 72. And then we're going to do this with the bottom one. So I'll have negative 1 times 35, which will just give me 35. And then 1 times 8, which will just give me a negative 8. So we're going to subtract these things. When I subtract this, it just gives me 72. And when I subtract this, it gives me 27. And then I'm going to divide it by 9. So my final answer should be 8 over 3. And so now we've found what z equals. It equals 8 over 3. Let's do a second example. So, if you remember in the past, we could solve these things by elimination. But now that we know how matrices work, we could also solve them with matrix equations. So this thing could also be this matrix. 8, 14, negative 6, negative 7, xy equals 4 over negative 10. So again, we're going to do the exact same steps. We're going to inverse this matrix. After we inverse this matrix, we're going to times both sides by it. When we times this side, it should become the identity. And when we times this side, it should give us what our x value is and what our y value is. So let's invert that matrix. To start out, we'll find the determinant, which for this one will equal negative 56 minus a negative 6 times 14, 84. And then we would find what that equals. So negative 56 minus negative 8, well, 84, will give me 28. So again, we're going to take this and divide it at the very end. Let's inverse that matrix. So I'll have negative 7 and 8. They swap places. Negative 14 and negative 6, or positive 6. Sorry about that. So these swap signs. We times it on this side, it gives us the identity. So it kind of goes away. We times it on this side. And again, matrix multiplication is row by column. So when I take this row and times it by this column, I should get negative 28 plus 140, and row by column again. So 24 minus 80. Then after I do that adding and subtracting, I will divide that thing by 28. So let's see what that will all give us. Negative 28 and 140 gives us 112. And 24 minus 80 gives me negative 56. So now when I divide these things by 28, I get this top thing to be 4, and this bottom one to be negative 2. So the actual answers is x is 4 for this equation, and y is negative 2. And I found the answer to that matrix equation. So try some of the matrix equations in the first matrix equations quiz.